9mm versus 40 Smith & Wesson with our Underwood ammunition, and this is our heavy hitters, heavy ammunition here, heavy bullets. So our 9mm is a 147 grain. It is a plus P. It is rated at 1125 feet per second. Our 40 Smith & Wesson is actually a 200 grain, rated at 950 feet per second. The energy is pretty similar in both of them as far as the ratings go. A lot of people might ask, why would you use a plus P 9mm and not with the 40 Smith & Wesson? A lot of people don't realize that the 40 Smith & Wesson has a modern cartridge. It basically already is a plus P, if that makes any sense, as where the 9mm is not. And in modern times, because it's a 100-year-old cartridge, they've loaded up a little bit hotter. So 9mm versus 40 Smith & Wesson, both of these are using the Nosler bullet, and 200 grain is definitely not typical for 40 Smith & Wesson weight. So I'm going to use my 5-inch M&P pistols here, 5-inch barrels, M&P 9 and an M&P 40, to see how these compare. So I'm going to go through the chronograph, see what kind of velocity and accuracy I get at the same time. Then I'm going to do my 10% clear ballistic test here. I'm just going to go into plain clear ballistics to see what the best potential is of those cartridges are. And what I mean by that is, you know, a lot of times denim will cause hollow point to fill up and not expand. And hitting a rib simulation can sometimes cause that same issue. So I'm going to give those bullets the best possible chance to have hollow point expansion. Then after that, I'm going to do more of our real world simulation. I've lost my denim here. It's a little bit windy today. So we're going to go into 4 layers of denim. After that, we're going to have 3 inches of clear ballistics that represents our pectoral muscle. You got to remember, clear ballistics is roughly half representational flesh, so this is more like 1.5 inches pectoral muscle. But also skin in and of itself is more like 2 inches of ballistics gel as far as the elasticity of it. So after 3 inches of that, I'm going to have a 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard to represent hitting ribs or sternum, and then we'll go into the rest of the clear ballistics and see what kind of performance you get. And then after that, I'm going to shoot up my steel to see what kind of practical accuracy I get with these. So let's get started with this test. All right, first up we have our 9mm+P 147 grain, rated at 1125 feet per second. I'm about 5 yards from that target. So let's see what kind of accuracy, what kind of velocity I get with this 5-inch pistol. So see how close we get to 1125. 1151. 1153. 1143. 1143. 1150. So a little bit above rate of velocity, and surprisingly there's a little bit more recoil in that than what I'm used to in 9mm. So 40 Smith & Wesson, we're only rated at 950 feet per second, but it is a big 200 grain bullet, which is not typical for 40 Smith & Wesson. Let's see what I get with this. 951. 912. 925. 922. 932. And this is something a lot of people have been seeing a little bit lately with a lot of companies. For whatever reason, they're below rate of velocity with the 40, but with the 9mm they juice it up. So that makes quite a bit difference in our energy. But obviously our 40 Smith & Wesson should still have more momentum, so that might make a difference in the ballistic test. So let's set our ballistics gel block, see how these compare. All right, plain clear ballistics, our best potential for good performance. 9mm+P, let's see what this does. All right, let's set that with our 40 Smith & Wesson. Let's go take a look. All right, really no surprise here in a lot of ways that we have more penetration with our 40 Smith & Wesson. What I am kind of surprised at is that even though the energy is lower with that 40 Smith & Wesson, the energy dump is fantastic, and I think that's because that's a Nosler bullet. It doesn't look like we have really big expansion, but it looks like it's very consistent expansion. So what I'm seeing with the 40 is actually pretty impressive, and with the 9mm it's impressive as well. There's just not as much damage and not as much penetration. I have a broken off piece of pedal here with our 9mm, and the first 3 inches here are energy dump, and I find that to be an important thing. Flipped upside down, here's our 9, here's our 40. And I would say that it's very similar between both of those. So what we have for penetration with the 9mm is another piece of copper right here, busted off copper up here about 4 inches at about 7.5 inches. Our total penetration is about 16 inches even. So that's really good penetration for what it is. Now with our 40 Smith & Wesson 200 grain, we're at right there at about 20 inches of penetration. I would not consider that over penetration at all, because you know, your standard in ballistics gel, organic gel, is 12 to 18 inches, and I've noticed that clear ballistics is a little less dense. You'll get stuff that goes a couple inches further. So 20 inches in this I think is good. So let's put on our Denim, put in our MDF, see how they compare in more of our real world simulation. All right, 4 layers of Denim, a 1/4 inch medium density fiber board. See how our 9mm does. Let's set that back up and hit with the 40 now. All right, 40 Smith & Wesson, 4 layers of Denim, a 1/4 inch medium density fiber board. Let's go take a look. All right, definitely some differences here. What I am seeing here is a big difference here in our first 3 inches, because it does look like with our 9mm up here on top, or on the bottom I should say, there's quite a bit of energy dump going on. With our 40 Smith & Wesson, it looks like that Denim possibly clogged the hollow point because we didn't have enough velocity. And this is confirming the same thing here. Our 9mm had massive expansion here. Our 40 Smith & Wesson did not. And what we're seeing here is similar damage overall, probably some tumbling going on with the 40 Smith & Wesson, but our 9mm, we can definitely see it made a bigger entry hole as it drug in a lot of that medium density fiberboard. We have really good expansion, just looks about as good as it did in plain clear ballistics. We have a penetration, it's about the same, but this is about 16.25 instead of 16 inches. Now our 40 Smith & Wesson, it caused some good damage here, but that expansion was significantly limited. It pretty much prevented any real expansion at all. And what we have here is about 25 inches of penetration. That's definitely a little bit much. And we didn't have a whole lot of energy dump going through that fabric. So what I'm seeing here is definitely our 9mm when it comes to a regular personal defense round. That's definitely a lot better. Now our 40 Smith & Wesson, the over penetration wasn't super significant. It's not like it went through 2 blocks or anything. So I think that this is a little bit more suited for, you know, it'd be okay for personal defense, but if you had a bear coming at you, I'd rather have this 40 than that 9mm. But in just strictly personal defense, a hard hitting heavy bullet, this 9mm is pretty darn good. Our 40 Smith & Wesson, really no surprise, to be honest, because a 200 grain bullet is a very heavy bullet. You don't have a ton of case capacity with 40 Smith & Wesson, so you're not going to have a ton of velocity. It's kind of like, you know, like a 158 grain 38 special or a 180 grain 357 Magnum. They're typically a lot less powerful than the lighter versions. So let's take a close-up look at these bullets here, and I'm going to shoot my steel, see what kind of practical accuracy I can get with these. All right, so here's a close-up look at these bullets here. Here's our 9mm through our plain gel versus our 40 Smith & Wesson through our plain gel. Our 9mm had massive energy dump. Interesting here, we have petals on one side but not the other that are peeled back. Looks like I did see some bust off pieces up in here, so we busted off a couple pieces there, but still that made no difference to that. And I can't imagine that making it perform worse, because we're dropping petals early on. That's going to cause a lot of cutting, and it drugged these through. Just a massive amount of expansion overall and energy dump. This is very wicked, very sharp, hard petals. Now when we look at our 40 Smith & Wesson, even though this does not look as impressive, it still seems like a pretty good performer overall. It did kind of go to the side and expand out a weird angle, so that will kind of indicate that it's not hitting perfectly straight. At least it's not going in very, it's going to start to tumble quicker than if it was a lighter bullet, because the length ratio, sectional density, is a little bit long for something at that velocity. Now when we look at our medium density fiberboard hit, when we look at our 9mm here, it looks nearly as good as through a plain gel 9mm. And that's typically what we do see with 9mm and other cartridges that go through the medium density fiberboard or gold dot or HST or anything like that, is that they'll just get a little bit smaller, a little bit more damage, but if they still perform nearly as good, expand nearly as big, I'm going to say that's an absolute win for that cartridge. It's acceptable. Now when we look at our 40 Smith & Wesson through our medium density fiberboard, we just did not have enough velocity. That clogged with denim, and there's just not enough velocity to expand that out regardless, so we had over penetration. So technical fail for our 40 Smith & Wesson. Doesn't mean it's a terrible cartridge. It's kind of a niche cartridge though. I would say that if you want a hollow point, and a lot of times unexpanded hollow points don't over penetrate too badly. If you want a hollow point that's mostly going to be like, hey, I'm walking somewhere where there's a bear that might attack me or something like that, and you want that penetration, but you're also carrying that same gun in the city, and you're like, well, I want something that's gonna, you know, not over penetrate too much but still get deep penetration on an animal. I think this could be your niche round, but 9mm is definitely a better just straight up personal defense round. So that's what you get looking at these close up. All right, these pistols shoot really good, so I'm just gonna fire from various distances to see how they do for me in slow fire. So 9mm+P, 25 yards. Let's see how I can get this. All right, 40 Smith & Wesson. It's really hard. Let me back it up a little. All right, 40 yards from the target, 9mm+P. All right, 40 Smith & Wesson. Let me back it up to 75 yards for fun. All right, 75 yards from the target. Gotta remember this is just for fun here. Interesting though, a little experiment. You know, when we go that distance, the 200 grain 40 should actually have more energy than this 9mm because of the momentum, and that's where really momentum comes into play. So I'm interested to see how hard they might hit the steel. So 9mm, 75 yards. Right above the target. So that first shot, I saw it go above the target pretty far, so I was just aiming very low on that target. So that's where the point of impact was with those. Now 200 grains, this is pretty heavy for a 40. Just gonna aim center and see if I can make any hits. Again, this one shot over the target too. Pulled that one. All right, so I think the misses were just on me. However, both of these shot above the target with the center hold. And I see that mostly with revolvers where the bullet arcs its way up, but with this I just saw the same thing where it's going above the target. So both of these I had to aim at the very base of that silhouette in order to hit center heads. With the 9mm, it's a little bit easier to make hits with. The 40 Smith & Wesson, I think that was just me getting tired of shooting. So yeah, I started to make some misses with that, but definitely it seems like the 40 did hit harder on the steel at this distance. So both of these seem like pretty decent lows. However, looking at this, at least through 5-inch pistols, our 9mm had pretty much everything positive that we want to see. We got rate of velocity and then some. We had very good accuracy. I saw on paper we had perfect terminal ballistics performance. The accuracy seemed a little bit better at distance. With the 40 Smith & Wesson, below rate of velocity, the accuracy wasn't as good for me. It could just be me up at 5 yards. Terminal ballistics wasn't that good. I wasn't able to hit as many hits at distance with the 40 either. So I'm not really seeing a benefit to a 200 grain 40 Smith & Wesson. Now the 200 grain 40 caliber bullet is a fantastic bullet for 10mm. That's really what it was meant for. So this is what Underwood's doing, is they're taking the 200 grain, they're putting it in the 40 case, and they're like, here you go. But what you're doing is you're reducing that case capacity, and there's just not enough powder room for you to get much performance on that. So I fail to see any benefit to going to a 200 grain 40 Smith & Wesson unless it's like a hard cast. Now that would do a little bit better than a 180 grain hard cast if you were shooting a dangerous animal, even if you did have slightly less energy. But a 200 grain hollow point, what you're looking to get is expansion with a little bit more penetration than typical. And we're just not really, I mean, we saw that in the plain clear ballistic test, but there's just not enough velocity to overcome that denim out of a 5-inch pistol. So 40 Smith & Wesson, I don't see any reason for it to be in a 200 grain. It's a little gimmicky. Our 9mm with a +P 147 grain Nosler bullet, that did really good. So that's what you get today. So as always, comment, share, and like, and thanks for watching.